All right, well, welcome everybody. Just a couple of announcements to get things started. Your next homework assignment is due on Wednesday, and then the next thing on your plate after that is going to be homework 13, which is due on Monday the 19th. And then just as a reminder, the project is due on Wednesday the 21st. So that's kind of the way things go in life, is that responsibilities can pile up, and especially as you get close to the deadline for something. As the semester winds down, when the project is due, we're not able to take a break from all the other topics that we're also discussing. So you're going to have a homework assignment due on one day and then the project due on another. So I hope that you've managed to make some early progress on the project, and then that avoids having to try and cram it all together at the last minute. Now we'll talk about a few things related to the project today just to get started before we start on payback analysis. And what I wanted to show you is something that we've been through before. When I introduced the project, I showed you a couple of student examples, so here's one just to give you an idea of length. And let me begin by saying this. There isn't a minimum page length for the report, but what you're trying to do is convince me that you've taken it seriously and show that you've put some thought and effort into gathering research, that you've made a good faith effort to estimate your expenses, and that they're a realistic representation of what's actually going to happen when you graduate. And so some students are really detailed and thorough, and they put together a long report, and that's great. Other students don't take as much time to show that they've done research, and that's okay too. But there are going to be some people who don't put in as much work, and they're not going to get as high of a grade. When we take an exam, as long as you get the right answer, then like how detailed and thorough and flowery your solution is kind of doesn't matter as much as that you get the right answer. And the exam has one right answer. In a project like this, everyone's going to have different assumptions and maybe different spending patterns and living in a different place. And so your projects are by necessity going to look different, but some people aren't going to work as hard, and they're not going to get full credit if they don't take the project as seriously and put as much effort in, and if the report isn't as detailed and thorough. So just to give you an idea of this particular student, what they had done, they didn't get a perfect score on the project, but they did really well and got a high score on it. And so you can see that the income from work section talks about their intended career at the Army Corps of Engineers, and it goes through about a page and a half with supporting details, and there are citations to sources of information, and at the end of the report is a list of references. And so you'll notice it's more than just the link itself. It's okay if you get information from the internet, but a citation has to have more information than just pasting the link. Usually what's preferred is that you have the link, the date that it's accessed, and then, if known, who is the owner of the website and who is the author of the page in question. A lot of times for like a newspaper article, you'd have the link to the source, and then you'd also know the author name, you'd know the name of the publication, and then the date that you accessed it. So don't just paste links in for your references. You can see that their Part 2, the list of expenses, is pretty thorough and detailed, and they go through all the different categories of spending. And then later on in their spreadsheet, they also, this is kind of the foundation that would help me to understand some information that's included later in their Excel spreadsheet, which they also provided. And I guess here is some of that information related to utilities. And so they did a thorough job on sections 1 and 2. Here's the Extraordinary expenses, a couple of big life events are indicated in the extraordinary expenses. Retirement, though, this section isn't as detailed as it needs to be. I mean, most people are hoping to spend 20 years retired, enjoying life and doing things, and so I'd like you to think carefully about how your expenses may be different during the retired portion of your life. So I guess maybe the weak link in this particular report is that the retirement expenses section wasn't as thorough as it needs to be. You can see here in the investment section there is a little bit of information, but this person is kind of deciding that they're going to do a blend of stocks, bonds, and CDs, and that's good because every one of you who's aiming for a professional career is guaranteed to end up with some sort of an employer-sponsored retirement plan where you don't have the option of just putting all of your money into a savings account. It's going to be more sophisticated and more diversified than that. Your employer will likely match your contributions up to a certain level. And what most people end up doing is assembling a basket, a blend of some stocks, some mutual funds, some bonds and CDs, and by doing that you achieve kind of an equilibrium balance between risk and reward. Because if you put all of your money into a savings account that doesn't even pay 1%, when inflation is 3%, you're effectively losing money each year. So it would be unrealistic because that's not really what's going to happen, but also it would be bad investing. And so what you need to do is a little bit of outside reading on things like what's the typical rate of return for the US stock market. What could you expect to receive if you invest in a mutual fund that specializes in bond investments? And so, we've talked about those different categories of investing during the class this semester, but I think that you could just do a simple Google search or maybe go to the website The Motley Fool, which is a great starting place for investors who don't have a lot of experience learning about managing money. And this is where you can really shine and illustrate to me that you've put a little bit of effort into personal finance and training yourself about what kind of retirement plans may be available at the employer that you'd like to work. Here's a figure that shows the growth of the cumulative savings balance over time, and there's an accompanying table. Let me show you a table that I liked maybe even a little bit more. Here's from a different report. I tell you that these columns have to be in your report. And you should include your Excel file if you use Excel for calculations. But don't make your Excel file 50 columns wide and expect me to go in and find the data I'm looking for. You can make your spreadsheet as complicated as you like, but then on a separate workbook, a separate sheet, you need to be summarizing it with these specific column titles. And so, you may have an expense sheet, and you may have a sheet that shows maybe some retirement calculations, but then put it all together. This and only this is what I ought to be able to see in a single spot, because this allows me to see, for instance, what's the initial starting salary that's been assumed, and in the report where you're writing about your assumptions, I would be able to get information about, for example, what's the cost of living adjustment rate that you've assumed. A lot of employers will give 1 or 2% raise each year just to keep pace with inflation. And so in your report, you're maybe telling me what that rate is that you're assuming for increases in salary, and then you'll tell me in your report which years you're assuming that you receive a promotion and a big increase in salary having to do with an increase in responsibility and capabilities. In the report, you're telling me what year of your life you're assuming new dependents. And so if I see a sudden jump in your expenses, then I'd know that's because maybe you've added a partner and you're living in a different home now or something like that. You're going to explain to me in your report what rate of return you're assuming for your investments so that I can see in your investment yield column how you are calculating how much interest is being earned. Now here's the number one mistake that I see on the project. So if you listen to nothing else today, this is the most valuable thing that you can learn. Your investment yield for a given year isn't based on how much you saved that year. And so let's say a few years down the road when you've got a pile of money, because you've been working for a few years and you've got this cumulative savings balance. And so by the age of 27, this person is assuming that they've got $97,000 saved. And that some of it may be in a checking account, some of it may be in a retirement account. We don't have to worry about exactly where all that money is. We just know that that is the accumulated difference between how much was earned and how much was spent with interest added on. But here's the point. The amount of interest you make in a given year is related to your cumulative savings balance in the previous year. So, for example, you wouldn't make this much interest just because you saved $26,000 this year. This interest is based on the previous year's cumulative savings balance. And so think like you're writing a spreadsheet here, and I'll tell you what the formulas are for this spreadsheet. This cell, the cumulative savings balance, let me try and unselect here so I can, all right. The cumulative savings balance for this year is the previous year's cumulative savings balance, so it's the cell above it. So this cell equals that plus the amount saved this year plus the investment yield for this year. And this year's investment yield is based on last year's cumulative savings balance multiplied by the rate of return. So the number one mistake that I see is that people think the interest is a fraction of how much was saved this year, and it's not. The interest is based on how much money you had in the bank last year. That's how you should do it. And if you have questions about that, then please give me a call on Teams and I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. Okay, so let's move on now to talking about payback analysis. Oh, I just noticed there is a comment here. Should we factor our income tax expense into the income amount before typing it in, or the regular expenses? I suggest that what you should do is consider tax as an expense, so that in the spreadsheet, let me bring that up again. So in your table, the income that you list should be your income before taxes. They call that your gross income. And then the income tax that you pay would be just one of the things that you include in your expense column. Okay. Now let's talk about payback analysis. And this is going to, I hope, feel somewhat familiar to you, because we've done calculations related to this on 2 earlier occasions this semester, where we've looked at something going from a negative, like in the red, switching over to in the black. Like how long did it take to recover an investment that we had made earlier on. So we're kind of doing that same calculation once again. And so here's the setup. Let's say that you have a piece of capital equipment that's a costly piece of equipment, and it has a certain initial upfront cost. And if you're borrowing the money in order to purchase that item, you'd know the interest rate that you're going to have to pay. And presumably the reason that you're buying it is because it's going to increase the amount of revenue that you're able to earn. So you're getting a certain amount of net revenue each year. And of course, by net revenue, what we mean is the income minus the operating expenses. And so this net revenue is going to partly go towards paying off the equipment, and partly it's going to go towards giving your company profits. So that's the setup. What we want to know is, for these circumstances, for a certain amount of money, initial cost, loan rate, and revenue, how long is it going to take until the equipment is paid off? And that's what we're going to do in payback analysis, which is the topic of today's class meeting. And payback analysis is useful for screening purposes. It's just one of the ways that we can see if a project is suitable. It's another way of looking at a project to know whether it's a thumbs up in the initial screening or thumbs down. Now this is how we've looked at the similar topic before. I think you remember we talked about unrecovered investment balance in the context of what if you operated a food truck. Remember that food truck selling expensive hot dogs? This is that figure when we were working through an in-class exercise that day, and we knew that there was some big lump sum of money that we were going to be spending to purchase equipment, and then because of interest adding to the expenses over time, then our unrecovered investment balance would swell to a certain amount, and then the net revenue would bring that unrecovered investment balance down, and then it would gradually go up because of the effective interest, and then after a certain number of years we would pay that off and we'd be down to zero unrecovered investment balance. So this is where we've done the similar thinking before. Let's cover some terminology. The payback period is how long it takes in order to justify an initial purchase at a given rate of return. And we can justify a purchase either if it is giving us additional revenue or if it is going to be saving the company money. Remember this idea that costs that you used to incur that are reduced by spending can be considered as an inflow. It's that example of what if you have a warehouse and you spend money to heat it each month, but then you decide to add some additional insulation in the warehouse, and so then that brings the heating costs down. Even though we haven't said anything about earning more money, the simple fact that that insulation reduces your heating costs each month, that change in the heating costs counts as an inflow. So either one can justify a purchase, revenue or savings of money that used to be spent. And the rate of return can be looked at two different ways. On the one hand, the rate of return may be the interest that you have to pay to a bank for the privilege of borrowing their money. And that would be if you were financing the project with borrowed money. But then on the other hand, if you're financing the project with your own money, then think that you have other opportunities. You could have your money in a savings account, or you may have other projects where you know the rate of return for those projects, and so you would have a minimum acceptable rate of return related to your opportunity cost. And so you want to not only generate additional revenue, but then you want to have a certain level of profit that you take for yourself. And so that could be the basis of the I in a payback period. Simple payback is just where you're assuming that money has no changing value over time. In other words, that there's no inflation or that you don't need to earn a rate of return. And that's usually not a realistic assumption. Especially now, people are sure getting nervous about inflation. I don't know if you follow the news or economic news, but all of the stimulus spending is really having an effect. I recently purchased a car just over the weekend, and it's kind of remarkable. I've been thinking about getting a car for probably 5 or 6 months, and just the supply of available vehicles has just dried up. And it's, I think, partly because COVID has reduced some specialized components that automakers need. They talk about like a semiconductor shortage and that chips are in short supply for going into cars. And so I think it's partly related to just shortages of materials, but it's also that there's just all this demand now that quarantines and restrictions are stopping. And so people had put off purchases, and now they're starting to spend again, and especially that it's tax return season, and so people are getting their normal kind of, most people get a refund in March or April when they file their taxes. And then on top of that, there is the stimulus checks that came out related to COVID-19. They've been trickling, and then there was this big slug of money that just came, and so there's just like so few used cars available now. I stopped by the Subaru dealership in, I guess it's halfway between Huntington and Barbersville, and the guy that I talked to said that a year ago they had 130 cars on the lot available for sale. and now they only have 30 cars on the lot available for sale. That they've just been selling vehicles like never before. So the whole point of that is that interest rates are high right now. Well, inflation. People are really worried that because there's so much spending, so much demand, that that's going to drive costs up. So simple payback is not a realistic assumption. Discounted payback is what we ought to apply because we assume that future amounts, that money in the future is going to have less purchasing power than it does today. Payback analysis can tell us if the equipment we have in mind is going to last long enough to pay it off. And the absolute worst thing would be is if you buy some equipment and you're still trying to pay it off before it's not even, you're still paying it off after its useful life has ended. Like you wouldn't want to buy a car that's going to take you 7 years to pay off if that car breaks down and is no longer functional after just 3 or 4 years. So payback analysis you use for initial screening, and you can also compare projects as long as a couple of conditions are met. It can only be used for comparison between alternatives. If the two projects are going to have the same useful life and they generate the same amount of revenue. And if those two things are true, then what you ought to do, your decision criteria would be to select the alternative that can be paid off most quickly. Now, here's a warning that after the payback period, then the payback analysis kind of disregards what happens after the item is paid off. So that's why you wouldn't use it to pick alternatives that have different useful lives. Is one alternative may suddenly have a huge increase in costs later in its life compared to the other, and so payback analysis doesn't necessarily tell you which alternative is going to be most profitable. It just tells you if the alternatives are suitable on the basis of the life of the equipment compared to how long it takes to pay back. Okay, yeah, it looks like maybe some people weren't seeing video for a moment there, and if you refresh, then you'll see it. All right. Let's take a look at the in-class exercise. Let me bring it up. This is what it should look like, which you've got printed, hopefully. You can see that the 8% table is on the back side of the paper on page 2. And the reason why that's provided is we're going to look at this a couple of different ways. We have some equipment that has a useful life of 18 years. We want to see if it's potentially suitable. And so its initial purchase price is $92,000, and then it's going to generate net revenue each year of $11,000. And since our MAR is 8%, what we want to know is how long is it going to take until the annual revenue is equal to the initial purchase price. So how many years? And what you can do in part A is use the table lookup factors to find out, at 8%, where does the P/A ratio equal the same thing as P divided by A. So I give you some hints here inside of the brackets. What is P? What is A? What is P divided by A? And then go to the table, the P/A table, and where you find that same ratio is how many years it takes to pay off the equipment. All right, and then use Microsoft Excel to verify that. So we're going to use the following column titles: year, amount, PV of amount, and unrecovered investment balance. Okay, so we're going to try and make this one quick so that we've got enough time to do both part 1 and part 2. So we're not going to go to the breakout groups. What I'll do is just pause for a moment while you do the calculations, and then as you set up the spreadsheet for part B. If you want to give Part C a try with this NPER function. You're welcome to give that a shot, but if it doesn't make sense to you, you can't figure it out, then I'll give a demo of that in just a couple of minutes. All right, so let me pause for a second so that you can do these first calculations by hand in Part A using the 8% table, and then with Part B setting up a spreadsheet with these following column titles. Okay, so here's what we have so far, is if P is 92,000 and A is 11,000, then the ratio of P to A is 8.36. So now let's go to the table and look for, okay, I may have it 8.36. Here's the table. We're looking for where did the P to A cross over to 8.36, and so 14 years is not quite long enough. You see here at 14 it says 8.2, and then after 15 years we're over it, 8.5. So what that means is that by the 15th year, then we will have justified the equipment. So 15 years. Now let's do it with the Excel method just to verify. So let me start Excel and show you how we can easily set that up and verify the same information. Excel sure opens slower since I installed the solver on it. Powerful tool, but I don't know why it takes so long to load. Alright, so here we go. First at the top we need to specify the interest rate is 8%, so 0.08. And then we're going to put the column titles in that were specified on the handout. It's year, amount, PV of amount, and unrecovered investment balance. Okay, so in year 0 through, let's just go through maybe 20 years to see where things end up after 20 years of operation. The problem statement doesn't specifically say how long the equipment lasts. Oh, 18 years, has a useful life of 18 years. So let me terminate at 18. Okay. So in year 0 we pay 92,000. So that's minus 92,000. It's an outflow, and I'm going to format all of these at the outset as currency. And then in each year following that, then it's $11,000 in net revenue. So that continues down through the 18th year. And now PV of amount, we're going to refer up here to the interest rate and anchor that reference. N will simply be whichever year we're on. And then skip over the payment field because we're treating these amounts as individual single lump sums sometime in the future. So I'm putting it into the future value field. And what it shows is over time how this 11,000 in revenue that we get 18 years from now doesn't really have much buying power when discounted to the present at 8% per year. So the unrecovered investment balance for the first year is just simply our outflow, and then the previous the next row is the previous year's unrecovered investment balance plus the PV of the amount that came in this year. So what we want to see is when is the crossover point for it to become positive. And you can see it's after 15 years it's positive. 14 wasn't quite enough, but 15, then we have paid off the equipment and earned a little bit of profit. So that's consistent with what the ratio method told us when we found that P/A ratio, and that corresponded to the 15th year. Now in part C, we're going to use the NPER function to find the number of periods. And so if you think about what are the financial functions we've learned. We learned PV, we learned FV, We learned PMT, which is how you find the amount of an annual series. That's like find A given either an F or a P, or both in the case of capital recovery. Now, the NPER function is how you solve for N. It means the number of periods. So let me do the NPER function. Okay, so it's equals to tell Excel that we're starting a function, and then NPER, and as soon as we put in the parentheses, it starts giving us those hints. Firstly, it wants to know the rate, so I'll click up here to the interest rate of 8%, and then comma, it's asking to know the payment amount. Now, PMT refers to a recurring amount that's the same during each period. And for us, that's 11,000. So it's an 11,000 recurring payment, comma. The present value is the initial purchase price that we had with this equipment, so negative 92,000. And of course, I could have clicked in the cell that had that number as well. And now close parentheses, and it's going to solve for the number of periods required to bring balance between the inflow and the outflows. It says 14, but what it means, it's just because that column is formatted as a currency, but if I change it to just become a number, it's saying after 14.37 years, then the equipment is paid off. That just means that it's closer to the 14th than to the 15th, but our standard that we'll apply is we always want to know how many years until it's completely paid off and you've made a little bit of revenue. So what we'd say is 15 years is when it's paid off, and if it lasts for 18 years, then this equipment is potentially suitable. So here's our conclusion. The equipment is potentially suitable because its useful life exceeds the payback time. All right. Any questions about that? All right. Let me show you the NPER function one more time. Okay, so that is equals NPER and then parentheses. Okay, so it's asking for the rate. So let me just click in the location this time rather than typing in the amounts. So I'll click up here to the rate and then a comma, and it's asking PMT. That means what is the amount of the recurring payment? It's saying what is the A that happens multiple times? And the A that happens multiple times is 11,000. Comma. PV is just the initial purchase price of the equipment. So that's the amount here in year 0. So I'll click on that amount. And now I can close parentheses. And when I do, it says 11.37 years. Oh, sorry, 14.37. All right. Good. That's question 1. Question 2 is comparing two different pieces of equipment. We've got machine X and machine Y. And both of them have the initial purchase price provided. Machine X has a constant net revenue every year, whereas machine Y has a variable net revenue. If we have a 14-year study period, then we're going to have to purchase machine X 2 times. So let's assume that we are doing the least common multiples, LCM, where we repeat the cash flow a second time for machine X. So that means we're going to have 14 years of data in our spreadsheet. Machine Y will go through 1 cycle, machine X will go through 2 cycles. So determine the unrecovered investment balance for both machines over time, which means we're going to do this same thing except for 2 equipment items. So let's see, do I say what is the interest rate for this one? 8% again. let me just make a copy of this spreadsheet. So I'm right-clicking down at the bottom where it says Sheet 1. If I right-click, move or copy, create a copy. So now what I can do is I can say, like, here's part 2, whereas this was part 1 of the in-class exercise. So part 2, I'm going to have machine X and machine Y. And I need to have these same columns for machine Y. And this second problem said that we have a 14-year time horizon. So let me do this. I'll delete these rows and clear out all this data. Now we're not going to do the NPR thing at first, and I guess we haven't yet drawn the conclusion, so I probably better delete that as well. We just want to compare machine X to machine Y. So fill in the tables and do that analysis where you're calculating the unrecovered investment balance over time, because we want to see when is the equipment paid off. What this is asking is, what's the payback time for machine X and what's the payback time for machine Y, and then just based on payback times, which equipment maybe looks better at first glance. And then this is asking to calculate the present worth of both alternatives. So we'll do that as well. Let me give you a couple of minutes to start putting that data in. Oh, it's 12:40 right now, so we've got 10 minutes until class is over. I think that'll be enough time. Keep working if you're working on it. I'm not going to narrate this, but I'm going to start typing the numbers in just to make sure that I've got enough time. But if you're working, don't let me interrupt you. You'll notice if you're following along with my solution that I added another column for machine Y. Like the amount, we need to have for each option an amount column, a PV of amount column, and also a column that describes the unrecovered investment balance. And so the amounts are different for machine X versus machine Y. You'll notice that machine X has a steady revenue each year of $3,000, and then we have to buy it again in the 7th year. So that's why we have that odd negative $9,000, is that we've got the combined cost of $12,000 of buying the equipment, as well as that year's revenue is $3,000. So year 7 is kind of an exception. We've seen that before when we apply LCM. But column B is the amounts. Column C, we're using the PV function to find the present value of those amounts. And then here in column D is the unrecovered investment balance. And that, of course, is the cell that's above it plus the cell that's to the left. Now, the interesting thing is that we pay off the equipment after about 5 years. And so the 6th year, we're operating the equipment profitably. But then, since we have to buy the equipment again, we don't really break even for the 2nd time until we get to year 8. I'm sorry, year 10. Yeah, in year 10, we're now back into the positive. And so it may appear at first glance that it's the equipment that's going to pay off quicker because, it's profitable after 6 years, compared to it takes 8 years for option Y to become profitable. But then when we repeat the cycle, then it's not until the 10th year of the study period that machine X is genuinely profitable. So it's a complicated situation, but this kind of analysis would allow us to come to the conclusion that over the study period, machine Y is going to be more profitable. And the way that we can verify that, this says based on present worth, which machine should be purchased. So let's do the NPV function. Do you remember that and how to use it? Equals NPV. We put in the interest rate, which is 8%. And the only amounts we put into the NPV function are those which are in the future. So you'll notice that in this range that I'm selecting, I start with year 1, and then outside of the NPV function is where I add in separately the amount that's already at the present. And so that my true net present value is going to be 5,730 for machine X. And then for machine Y, NPV, I'll put in this reference to 8%, and the range will only include those amounts that are in the future. And outside of the range, I'm adding on this amount that's already at time 0. And what it shows is machine Y is more profitable. So, conclusions. The break-even analysis, I guess let's call it payback analysis. I mean, it could be considered break-even because the break-even point is when you finally have more revenue than your original unrecovered investment balance. But the payback analysis shows that machine X doesn't truly become paid off until the 10th year of the study period, compared to 8 for machine Y. So that's one conclusion. And then the other conclusion is that present value analysis shows that machine Y is more profitable. Okay? Well, we've done it. It's 12:50. Once again, we're out of time. Time flies when you're having fun. Our announcements are that Homework 12 is due on Wednesday. In addition to that, you should also be working on the project. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to have you call me on Teams. That's the best way to get in touch because we can talk back and forth and I can understand a little bit better what maybe is giving you trouble. So feel free to give me a call on Teams. I hope you have a great day, everybody. I'll see you on Wednesday.